Good morning. Welcome to rainy San Francisco, which we in California are actually quite delighted to have. So my name is Tim Brewer, and on behalf of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you here to San Francisco, where we're going to talk about bridging sustainability future in global health. But first, some just general business kind of stuff. Thanks to the incredible generosity of the University of California, San Francisco, we will be having a reception tonight. Please, whoops, why are my slides whipping through by themselves? We'll be having a networking reception tonight. It's a wonderful opportunity to catch up with old friends as you're doing now, meet new friends, please do it. Coffee breaks, I'm not quite sure why I need to tell you about that. We have posters, believe it or not, over 1,000 abstracts submitted, over 700 posters. This is where you're going to see the cutting edge of what's happening in global health. Really make a chance to get there both days, and do please stop by the exhibits while you're there. If you need to use Wi-Fi, please do. Hilton Events, you got the password there, you can figure it out. We have our very own app. I have no idea what an app does, but we have one. Please use it, figure out what it does, and let me know. It apparently has a password, CUGH 16. I don't know why it needs a password, but do that. Social media, please tweet, please Facebook. I'm not sure these are verbs, but make anybody you know in global health who is not here jealous, okay? So that's what we're hoping you'll do. All right. Continuing medical education. If you're a doctor or a nurse, you get to go online to get the forms. If you're a dentist, you have to go to the booth. Don't ask me why. All right, and you do have to pay $20, but that's a terrific bargain. Okay, so we're going to be talking about sustainability in San Francisco. And to understand why that's important and relevant, we need to sidetrack back into some California history. So we're going back to January 24th, 1848, and James Marshall discovers gold flakes in the American River at Sutter's Mill, 40 miles northeast of what is now Sacramento. At that time, there were less than 1,000 non-natives living in what was known as the California territories, and by the time that information about gold made it all the way back to East Coast, it touched off what became the largest mass migration in United States history. So that by the end of 1849, there were over 100,000 people living in California, and by the time this finished, it was over 300,000. Now, if you were coming by land, you probably came with an ox, and what you did is you went through Salt Lake City. So on the Google map there, let's see if we have a pointer. We do, but I can't use it. So just somewhere up there is Salt Lake City. You're going to go through the Sierra Nevada. You're going to end up here in San Francisco. Google Maps will tell you that's 758 miles, and you can walk it in just over 10 days. Well, I can tell you in 1849, they would have thought Google Maps was using a California cash crop, and I don't mean avocados. Because if you're in an oxen cart and you're going to San Francisco, you got to go through the Sierra Nevada. Absolutely beautiful, but when you're not in a global warming situation, they're full of snow 6 months of the year. And that's exactly what happened in 1846 when 81 immigrants tried to get through there in October. They got trapped. By the time they were rescued in February of 1847, only 45 survivors. They survived by cannibalism. Donner Pass is named in their memory. And so when Jefferson Hunt was leading 107 wagon trains from Salt Lake City to San Francisco in October of 1849, he wisely said, we're going south on the old Spanish Trail around the Sierra Nevada. Well, they got about as far as Enterprise, Utah, when somebody came up to them and said, I have a map, and you can take a shortcut. They'll cut off about 500 miles. Well, fortunately, Captain Hunt was too smart for that, but 20 wagon trains made a right turn, and they ended up in what is known as the Timbisha Valley. There they wandered around for 2 months, struggling to survive. They had to slaughter their oxen and eat them. They had to burn their wagons. And when they finally made it out of that valley, one of the survivors is reported to have said, turned around and looked back and said, "Goodbye, Death Valley." Well, Death Valley is actually not dead. It is surprisingly and spectacularly beautiful. But, and directly relevant to our story, Death Valley has been home to the Timbisha Shoshone population for over 1,000 years. And the way they survive in Death Valley is they seasonally migrated between the valley floor and the mountains, living on pinyon pine nuts, mesquite beans, and on hunting. And so while Death Valley is not dead, it is fragile. And if you want to survive and thrive in Death Valley, you need to do it in a way that's sustainable. Fast forward to February 14th, 1990. This is Voyager 1 racing past Saturn on its way to become the very first man-made object to make it out of the solar system. It's 6 billion kilometers away. That's 3.7 billion miles if you're metrically challenged. And as it's going, it does one final photograph, a goodbye picture of the planet Earth. And let me read to you what Carl Sagan said about this photo. And I quote, "That's here, that's home, that's us. Everyone you ever loved, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives." But in fact, it's much more than that. As far as we know, every life form that ever existed in the entire universe, every microbe, every plant, every animal, has been found only in one place, right here. Which brings us to why we are here. The Earth is spectacularly beautiful, but as we're increasingly learning, it's fragile. And if we want to survive and to thrive, we're probably going to have to do it in a way that is sustainable. So, we have a wonderful conference today. We're talking about sustainability. We could not do this without the help of lots of organizations and people. I will not have time to read them all off. Again, I want to acknowledge the University of California, San Francisco for their generosity. But really, we thank all of these organizations, these government agencies, these universities and foundations. We could not have done it without you. And we could not have done it without the support and effort of a tremendous number of people. We had some really outstanding global health experts helping us. Jaime Sepulveda, who you will meet, was our equivalent of Captain Hunt. He got us through, way to go. Hailey DeBoss, Jonathan Samet, Michelle Berry, Tom Coates, Pat Conrad, Keith Martin, Steffi Strathdy, Stefano Bertozzi, and Judy Wasserheit. Thank you so much. And you can't do this without staff, and Jaime was supported by a very able staff here in San Francisco. Solange Madrez, I'm sorry, Solange, if I murdered your name, Colin Boyle, and Robert Mansfield. And a shout out to Daisy. Hi, Daisy. I did not have your picture, I'm sorry. And in Washington, we have the CUGH Secretariat helping Keith Martin, our Executive Director, Dalal Najjar, Karen Lamb, Amy Kasman, and Elazar Gutierrez. Thank you very, very much. And this beautiful hotel that we're here, the fact that the microphones work and there is coffee in the coffee machines, all due to the tireless efforts of two people, Doris Steinbeck and Norman Stein. Thank you very, very much. Which brings me back to Jaime Sepulveda. I have to read this so I get it right. So we could not have asked for a more talented, energetic person. It takes one person to have the vision and the leadership to get all those wagon trains to San Francisco, and Jaime was our person. check this out. At a time when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, Jaime had been Mexico's Director General of Epidemiology, the Vice Minister of Health, the Director of the National Institutes of Health, the Director General of the National Institute of Public Health, the Dean of the National School of Public Health. He had also had important leadership roles in the Gates Foundation and the Gavi Alliance, and for these and many other accomplishments has been inducted into the National Academy of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. And on top of that, if that were not enough, he also scored 2 goals in a World Cup qualifying match against the United States. All right, so I may have made that last one up. But it just goes to show what a remarkable individual he is. Please join me in thanking and welcoming to the podium Dr. Jaime Sepulveda.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, team, for those very generous words. Where did you get that photograph? I'm very curious now. So I'm Jaime Sepulveda. I'm head of Global Health Sciences here at UCSF. I'm really deeply honored to have served as the chair of this conference. This was a team effort, of course. We had a fabulous local organizing committee, and team already alluded to that. But special thanks to team, to Keith, and to both the local team and the secretariat who did such a splendid job. So I would like to welcome you all to San Francisco to this 2016 conference. Or perhaps I should say, welcome back. Many in the audience might not know that it was here in San Francisco in 2007 when the notion of this consortium of universities for global health was first conceived. So this is a good opportunity, I think, to recognize the leadership of Haile Debas as the CUGH founding director. Join me in welcoming and recognizing a great dealer. As Tim mentioned, the title of this conference is Bridging to a Sustainable Future in Global Health. Bridges and sustainability are 2 dear words and notions in my lexicon. And also 2 fundamental concepts underpinning this conference. The Golden Gate Bridge is, of course, a San Francisco icon. The Golden Gate Bridge also serves as a metaphorical reminder in this election political year that we in global health are all about building bridges and not building walls. The notion of sustainability should be at the core of what we do in global health. As our keynote speaker, Richard Horton, where's Richard? There he is, remind us, global health needs to be supplemented by a new perspective on our future, planetary health. He correctly claims that global sustainability is a precondition for human health, survival, and prosperity. Climate change is, of course, an important component of planetary health, but there are many other elements to be considered, as we will learn during his keynote. So sustainability is at the heart of what we do. We have the Millennium Development Goals, as the focus of our global developmental agenda. As you are all aware, these Sustainable Development Goals were signed at the UN Assembly last September. Now, the transition from MDGs to SDGs is a bumpy road. Some of the 17 SDGs and 169 targets are perhaps too ambitious. A few are unclear, others are unquantifiable, but at least they give us a sense of direction and also a sense of urgency. 2030 is around the corner, and we require a clear roadmap in global health for achieving the SDG 3 targets. Now, the discussion of the global goals also raises an important question for us. What is the role of universities in global health, in actually improving health and reducing inequities? We are a consortium of universities, after all, with global health as our field of study. In my view, universities should not only be about knowledge creation through research or knowledge transmission to our students, but we also have to be about the translation and application of that knowledge to improve people's life and social conditions worldwide. Our concluding plenary will precisely address the role of universities in global health. You might remember in the last CUGH conference in Boston, the Ebola epidemic in West Africa was a major reason for concern, and justifiably so. Larry Summers called Ebola a stress test for health systems in West Africa. Well, those systems tragically failed. And WHO failed. And to be fair, we all failed. In spite of several emerging epidemics, pandemics, the global health architecture is still unprepared to confront pandemics. We need a more robust global surveillance system, more and better financing to strengthen local health systems, and a much better training of the health workforce. There is so much we can do as universities to train the leaders that the world needs. This time, we have a new tragic pandemic in the news. The horrendous consequences of the Zika virus now in the Western Hemisphere. Just imagine the impact on the babies and their families. This virus, by attacking specifically the cortex of the brain of the growing fetus, it robs the new baby from the very condition, intelligence, that makes our species distinct. Zika virus also is present in infected males both in blood and in semen, converting these fluids paradoxically from vehicles of life to vectors of disease. The shocking speed with which Zika has entered the New World is another reminder of how interdependent our world has become, with almost 2 billion people each year traveling on commercial airlines internationally. And the distribution of the disease in the Southern Hemisphere is also a reminder of the huge health inequities in the world. It is poor people in poor countries that suffer the most. The famous aphorism by Rudolf Virchow, medicine is a social sciences and politics is nothing but medicine on a large scale, applies to our current political context. Indeed, we are at the political crossroads in this country, and we have the responsibility to vote according to our convictions, and for the sort of leaders who understand that we live in a globalized world, that no country can afford isolation, that Islam is not synonymous with terrorism, that Mexicans are not rapists, that economic protectionism is counterproductive, that compassion is better than aggression, and that nobody cares about the size of your hands. The world needs principled and rational leaders who can see beyond the next election and contribute to improve health, both the health of the people, but also the health of the planet itself. So the consequences of the upcoming election are significant for us in global health for a number of reasons. There are many things in the balance. Funding for global health and foreign aid programs, changes in the structure for international research, and most certainly increased tensions, if not war, with other countries. In short, a real danger to lose many of the achievements in global health. But I am an optimist and believe we can also see other more positive scenarios. The right kind of global leadership combined with evidence-based policies, which we as academics are well placed to provide, could open the door to continued progress in global health issues and sustain the momentum that we have built over the last 15 years. Let me quote two quick examples of reasons for optimism. Since the turn of the new century, we have new institutions like Gavi, the Global Fund. We have new funding, Gates Foundation, PEPFAR. We have a renewed political will, MDGs, SDGs as example. One example that is also dear to my heart, Gavi and vaccinations in the developing world. We have countries, low and middle income countries like Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania, Sri Lanka, China, Mexico, and Brazil that actually have higher immunization rates than France, Italy, the UK, Denmark, and the US. So it is possible to think that by 2030, we might have convergence in life expectancy between low, middle income, and rich countries. So in that cautious, optimistic spirit, I encourage you to make the most of your time here at the conference. Expose yourself to panels and topics that are outside your area of comfort or expertise, since we all need to understand the broader context of our work and see how different ideas and disciplines can contribute to our goals. Spend time getting to know other attendees at the conference and learn what they do. When I was at the Gates Foundation with my dear boss, Tachi Yamada, we frequently quoted the old African aphorism, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Remember, in global health, we want to go far, and that means we have to go together. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I'm Keith Martin, Executive Director of CUGH, and I want to thank all of you for being here today, particularly those of you who come from afar, because you're actually part of something that hasn't happened before. You have shattered our attendance record for a CUGH Global Health Conference. Thank you very much. There's more than 1,800 people. Yes. More than 1,800 people have come to attend our event over the last few days, and yesterday's satellite sessions we had, which were full days, were fully attended with more than 1,000 people. But before I go any further, I have to take your picture, Because as Tim said, we want to tell the world about what's happening, right? So I need you to smile. And don't worry, I'll get you guys too. And I need you to retweet this. It's at CUGH News, so we'll get that up. So there you go. Please smile. Okay, you guys get to be really happy and wave. Okay, this is a double randomized test. We'll decide who actually gets the most tweets, right? Out of that. I'd like to, as was mentioned before by both Tim and Jaime, this event wouldn't have happened without the efforts of the many. And so I'm going to embarrass a few people here. I'd like my staff to stand up and wave. Dalal Najjar, our Director of Operations. Karen Lamb, our Manager of Conference and Events. Amy Kasman, keep standing. Amy Kasman, our Administrative Assistant, as well as Eleazar Gutierrez. They work tirelessly, and we have 3 wonderful interns here who are helping us also to make this happen throughout the year. Also, Jaime, thank you very much for your leadership and the great work that you and your team did. Solange, Colin, Daisy, so many others. So much work went on between the 2 of our offices. We're exceptionally grateful. When we decided to choose a theme for the conference, we wanted to make something very, very big. And as you can see, Bridging to a Sustainable Future really gets to the heart of what global health is: the sustainability of the planet and the sustainability of people. I think I got a slide here. If that slide could come up, please, that would be great. Let's see. Yeah, they'll get it up. Sustainability of the planet and sustainability of the people, both of those. That is, in essence, the heart of global health, isn't it? So as we move forward, I'd like you to consider a couple of things as you meet and deliberate. How can we aggregate what we actually currently know and share it? How can we aggregate what works? Because we know what actually is needed to address most challenges, right? Secondly, how do we build, sustain, and retain the challenges that exist in this world? Move forward. There you go. How do we build and sustain and retain the human resources capabilities that are that are lacking in a great part of the world? Not only in the medical skills, but importantly in the non-medical skills. Thirdly, how can we work together to strengthen not only health systems, but also finance, public works, justice, the underpinning of what is necessary to actually advance what actually works. Get political. Whether a university is built, a clinic is built, or a vaccine is actually delivered, those are decisions, right? Those are choices. And those are political decisions and political choices. There is no other group whose voice could be more powerful and more effective at changing the discourse that's taking place not only here and other places to advance, as Jaime said, the kind of solutions we need that put human beings and people at the center of what is necessary. We need your voices, and we need them loudly. So get political, not only for the politicians, but importantly for the public. The public moves the political, right? So please, we have an opportunity and indeed an obligation to educate the public and advocate well and advocate often. So that's all I have to say, and I have the distinct pleasure of lastly, we have that app. Please use it, because what you'll find on the app are a lot of resources that are germane to the wonderful presentations we have today. And I'd like to thank the speakers, thank the sponsors, and all of you who have come to make this a great celebration of global health. So now I have the great pleasure of doing the very long introduction that our next speaker wanted. Global health leader, advocate, dynamo, the editor of The Lancet, and very importantly, a great friend of global health, Dr. Richard Horton. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. Now, let's see if we can figure this out. I have no idea how to get my slides up from here. But I'm looking at our friends at the back, and I know that they will do something magical for me. Oh, look, you see, my fellow friend. Fabulous. I can see it appearing there.
Just in case, don't use that.
Are we good? We're good.
It's all you.
Fantastic. I learnt a new word last year from some friends of mine in China. That word was yuan fen. It's a wonderful word. It means fate without destiny. And it's a great word because it's a classic breakup line in a relationship. So remember this. I wish I'd known this 30 years ago. We had the fate to meet, and I'm so glad that we met. And we've had a wonderful time together. Thank you. But, you know, it just wasn't our destiny to stay together. So it's beautiful. You know, it's a really gentle way to say, sorry, it's not going to work out. We know our fate. It's disturbing, it's perplexing, it's even sometimes quite shocking, the predicament of our own existence. But we don't yet know our destiny. We don't yet know the place where we're going to end up, where we're going to come to rest. When I was a young boy, I was mesmerized by 3 photographs from my father, which I found in a photograph album at home. And these are these 3 photographs I'm showing you now. It's a scan across what was once a city. And many of you will recognize what that city is. It's Hiroshima. In 1945, August the 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and shortly thereafter one on Nagasaki. And very soon after that, British forces, along with others, went into those 2 cities to work with survivors, to rebuild homes, to rebuild lives. And he was one of those and took these 3 photographs from the side of a hill. When I put those together and got them digitally remastered, you can see the panorama of devastation that was Hiroshima. And if you zoom in on some of those scenes in that panorama, you get a little sense of the aftermath. First, you recognize some famous landmarks of today, the atomic dome. But then you also see some strange and tragic icons, a twisted, burnt tree still standing by the river, a bridge newly built, homes, shacks newly constructed for the survivors who were left. People, you wonder what they're thinking, going about their daily lives. Families digging, perhaps planting new crops. Children going to school. Children in school, beginning a new hopeful vision for the future. And even then, in 1945, 1946, laughter. Those children are in their 80s today. In a wonderfully moving account of the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima, written by Michihiko Hashiya, a journal of a Japanese doctor, he tells the story of what it was like to piece together those lives. Think, it's the immediate aftermath of an atomic bomb. Many people have died, and he is a doctor who has survived. And with his colleagues, nurses, doctors, other health professionals, they're trying to understand what has gone on. They have people in their hospitals, and initially they seem fine. And then they begin to get a rampant gastroenteritis. And his first thought is that this is an infectious epidemic sweeping across the survivors of Hiroshima. Of course, it turns out to be one of the effects of radiation sickness. But he begins then to start writing his story in a diary. And it's an extraordinarily moving story. The hour was early, the morning still warm and beautiful. Suddenly a strong flash of light startled me, and then another. It's almost poetic. The exodus of a people who walked in the realm of dreams. And then he had an epiphany. He needed to put this story down on paper. He needed to tell this story for others to read and understand. Finally, late into the night, my mind grew sharper and my pen stronger. The importance of summarizing and presenting our findings became all the more apparent to me. What he was telling us is a message that is so relevant to us in this room today. The power of the word as witness. The idea that the quality of our communication, one with another, across peoples, across cultures, the choice of language that we use will determine whether we speak about truth or error, right or wrong, life or death. In other words, writing, reporting, and describing what we see in an effort to remove any misunderstanding between us is about protecting us from further acts of violence that we do to one another. Our goal is to seek to build new communities of trust, global communities of trust. The point, the idea, is writing as a means not to tell your story only, but to listen to the other side of the story, and then to listen to our own responses to the other side even harder. Now that was 1945. That was then. This is now. Syria today. November the 13th in Paris. March the 22nd in Belgium. What has happened to us? Abbas al-Zaim, writing in The Lancet 2 years ago, surveying the predicament across the Arab world region, wrote this: "We argue that the current discourse on health, population, and development has largely failed to convey a sense of urgency when the survival of whole communities is at stake. It's an issue of survival, not even development, it's survival." Now, how do we begin to conceive a response to that? John Rawls, 3 years before he died, the great theoretician of justice, wrote a book called The Law of Peoples. That was in 1999. And he courageously, although some might say naively, but I believe very bravely, spoke about the idea of a realistic utopia. I begin and I end with the idea of a realistic utopia. Now, those who've written about utopias in the past, whether it was Plato in his Republic or Thomas More in his book Utopia, have generally been ridiculed for their vision of creating the perfect society. But Rawls was inviting us to consider a realistic utopia. He believed that a society of peoples is possible to create. Why? For 4 very good reasons. Everybody in this room is different. You will all have different histories, different political views, perhaps come from different cultures, you have different religions. We can live together with reasonable difference. Out of that diversity comes a common unity, a shared set of hopes and visions for our future. The great advantage we have is that we have this deliberative capacity, this ability to have a dialogue one with another in public. And finally, that we can do that within an environment of democratic peace. Now, not all the time, everywhere, can we do these things. But we've proven that we can do it. We can achieve it. So what is our realistic utopia? And as you've heard, it is the idea of sustainable development. And the reason why this is a beautiful idea is because it is universal. It is truly about all of us. It's about the notion of intergenerational equity, that future generations are as important as our own generation. It's about not us. It's about the oneness of all life on this planet. And not only that, the symbiosis between life and our planet. It's also about the centrality of human systems. It is down to us to shape the future, not of our fate, but indeed of our destiny. Now, I'm not going to insult your intelligence by testing you on the Sustainable Development Goals. You know what they are. You know that there's an unfinished agenda on poverty, hunger, health, education, gender, water and sanitation, and there's a whole bunch of new things which I've grouped into different colors to reflect, in a sense, different categories, extending the idea of development across energy, economic growth, infrastructure, inequality, cities, and consumption and production, and then setting that in a broader context of climate change, sustainable oceans, ecosystems, and the notion of a wider vision for justice and peace. How are we going to do that? Revitalizing partnerships. You and I have an agenda. We know our agenda, it's SDG 3, and we have 9 targets within SDG 3, and we have various means for how we're going to achieve those targets. We know all that. That's our manifesto for the next 15 years. But is it? Do you recognize this gentleman? We don't do moustaches like that today, do we? It's a fantastic moustache, actually. It's Friedrich Nietzsche. And he said this: words are but symbols for the relation of things to one another and to us. Nowhere do they touch upon absolute truth. The relation of things. It would be a severe mistake if we interpret the Sustainable Development Goals for us in global health as being only about global health. We have to cross outside of health and think about the relation between health and other dimensions of what is being defined as sustainability. Let me give you some examples. We can't think about health without thinking about education. If you're saving a child, fantastic. But what are you saving that child for? Unless we invest in early childhood development so that we lift that child from being on a curve of reduced potential, the red line, so that we get them on a curve of maximum potential, that's how we can achieve the potential of our species. And not only do we live to deliver a child from survival to their potential, but then we also have to think about their adolescence and the forces, including the political, social, economic determinants of those futures for those adolescents. We need to think about health and gender. We can't achieve sustainability without putting gender at the heart of our vision. We have Afaf Malay in the audience. She co-chaired a commission with Anna Langer looking at women and health. Felicia Nall, I think, is here as well, and it was thanks to her calculations that we realized for the first time the enormous, uncounted contribution that women make. Uncounted, unrewarded, uncompensated, but nevertheless they're contributing in health alone, through health alone, to 5% of global GDP, both paid and unpaid work. We can't consider sustainable development and achieving health unless we think about the connection between health and economic growth. And I'm grateful for a collaboration between WHO, ILO, and OECD, chaired by two individuals, Francois Hollande and Jacob Zuma, looking at the relation between health employment and economic growth. Because the general view amongst economists, my friends, sometimes, William Balmoral, an economist, wrote that health is a problem to the world, not a solution, because it's a cost disease. Because it involves human beings, it's a problem, because we're not able to easily increase productivity of health systems. Therefore, in his words, a health system is a stagnant service. It's a problem. It's a drag on the economy. Not so. I sneaked this little photograph in Lyon a couple of weeks ago, where President Hollande, his mind, I think, on other things, because he was on his iPhone most of the time, and Jacob Zuma, who's definitely got his mind on other things at the moment. But nevertheless, they were there. They were there, leading this commission to look at the investment in health employment and its contribution to economic growth. We can't think about succeeding in health without linking health to SDG 16, the idea of justice. And John Monaghan is in the audience, and John at Georgetown University is leading a commission with us looking at the link between justice and health. The rule of law has a very close relationship to health. This work done by Amit Ataran and his colleagues, looking here at various dimensions of health: infant mortality, maternal mortality, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and looking at measures of the rule of law and seeing that there is indeed a relationship. You can't do a health system in the abstract without thinking of the whole of the society. And that's what Friedrich Nietzsche is inviting us to do when we think about the SDGs. Now, can we go further than that? Is there an idea, is there a practice or a discipline that unifies our concerns about the survival of life on our living planet? Well, perhaps we have our unit of analysis wrong. I trained in clinical medicine, and the patient in front of me was everything. Fantastic. Then I heard that there was this thing called public health, and that's about society. Great. But let us think also about a different level, the level of the human civilization, a much bigger level, human culture. And Stephen Boyden, in his book, The Biology of Civilization, wrote about this quintessential paradox that we as a species have on this planet. While the main threats to humankind today are the consequence of the human aptitude for culture, our only hope for overcoming them lies in this aptitude. So in 2014, a small group of us got together to think about a new idea for global health that would try and unify this diverse set of what was looking like the Sustainable Development Goals, and we called it Planetary Health. And we invited us to consider an urgent transformation that was required in our values and practices based on the recognition of our interdependence and the interconnectedness of the risks we face. The Rockefeller Foundation, we are forever grateful to for taking a gamble, a bet on this idea, and they established with us a commission on planetary health led by Andy Haynes, and you're going to see some of the commissioners in the next session. You know the trends very, very well. Rising population, enormous declines in poverty. Please read Angus Deaton's book, The Great Escape, which tells the story of how within just 250 years, we've pulled hundreds of millions, actually billions of people out of extreme poverty. We've seen rises in life expectancy, but at the same time, we've seen dramatic demands on energy, water, and land. We've seen the loss of tropical rainforests, the demand for water creating crises in water resource use, the acidification of our oceans, of course, temperature changes, and don't forget the oneness of life, the cataclysmic loss of biodiversity. What we were trying to do in this commission was to link two things. We were trying to connect the idea of the environmental impact of our species on the planet with human civilization. And we were trying to then think what would be the solutions for our civilization to draw us out of the threats we faced. And it's thinking about a different way in which we organize society. Today, our linear models for the economy are all about making things, using things, and then throwing them away, disposing of things. We don't think about the idea of a circular economy, where we reuse things, recycle objects that we use, or repair them. Today we think about owning things. In the future we need to think about being stewards of the resources we have around us. I'm all for human rights, but I'm not for the right to destroy. And right now, the right to destroy is one of those rights that governs and typifies the way we live on this planet. How can we change from a linear economy to a circular economy, even to go beyond that to a performance economy, which will be about stewardship, responsibility, and that shared ownership? Out of this commission came a definition. Put simply, planetary health is the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. And let us be in no doubt about the potential threat. And unfortunately, the 15 years of the SDGs doesn't even begin to put that threat into context. And this is the great predicament we face. Safar Motashariai, in a paper a couple of years ago looking at various scenarios for our future, he's a NASA scientist, and this is a group of NASA scientists, saw that if you combine ecological loss with deepening inequality, the future could look very dismal. But look at the time scale. It's not 15 years, it's not 50 years, or even 100 years. This is a 500-year time scale. We feel pretty secure now. The floor seems pretty solid. The room is standing up. If we go into museums in San Francisco, though, we will see artifacts from past civilizations that came and also felt as equally strong as we do today, because they didn't think on this time scale. And as you see the green line, the resources within the natural environment decline, and as you see the dark line of our cumulative global wealth increase, you can see that that wealth almost operates as a vaccine. We believe that we are immune to the destruction around us because we're smart, intelligent human beings who can solve any problem. We just need the money to do it. Wrong, if we carry on in the way we're going. And those, as was said in the opening session quite rightly, those who will reap the rewards of our stupidity will be those living in low-income situations most of all. Safar Motashariai calls those the commoners. They will be the ones who undergo the biggest devastation first. We, the elites, will feel relatively protected, but even for us, 400 years out, when it's too late to change, even our predicament will eventually catch us out. So the Commission set out 3 challenges. First, the challenge of imagination, reimagining the idea of prosperity. It's not just about wealth or even health. It's a much bigger idea about prosperity, which does include the oneness of life and the symbiosis of life and the planet. There's a challenge of knowledge. Do we have the right knowledge? Are we creating the right knowledge to solve these challenges? The answer is no, we're not, because our universities, to take that one example, are still deeply siloed. The rewards are perverse, and we're not creating the opportunities in the way we create knowledge to deliver the right knowledge in the context that we so richly need. And finally, implementation. How do we act together to implement what knowledge we do have to adjust our trajectory? Arnold Toynbee, a historian, wrote that civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. So how good is our suicide prevention? Helen Clark, who recently announced her candidacy for the UN Secretary General, in talking about the present state of global governance, spoke about paralysis, minimal outcomes, or failure. And remember, she's the head of UNDP and wants to be the head of the whole of the UN. But that's the organization she wants to head, one that's defined, she said this in 2012, one that is defined by paralysis, minimal outcomes, or failure. Now, the problem with this is that when we see our global systems failing, or people think they're failing, there is a temptation, an understandable temptation, to retreat into national isolation. The idea that if we can't rely on the rest of the world, we're going to be strong. Let's make my country strong again. I think we've heard that in this country. We're seeing it in my country, the United Kingdom, on June the 23rd, a vote to leave the European Union, which will be, in my view, a disaster. But that notion of retreating into nationalism is deeply dangerous. Alexander Herzen, when Russia was going through the same predicament in the 19th century, wrote, "An exclusive feeling of nationality is never productive of good." We have to lift our eyes. We have to lift our vision and think differently. One commission that was published in 2003, which most people have forgotten about now, led by Amartya Sen and Sadako Agata, was introducing the notion of human security. And they called for the idea of a global human identity. Not national identity, not cultural identity, not a single religious identity, but a global human identity that brings us together. And that identity, in a global sense, is the identity I believe we need to forge today. So what can we conclude? We can conclude that writing our story, which you are doing, which we try and help you do, protects human truths. A reasonable utopia is possible, and don't let anybody tell you it's not. But an exclusive focus on health will fail. Planetary health is one unifying idea that I would invite us to consider. Our global systems, however, are not working well. But if we retreat into extreme nationalism, that will destroy us for sure. We need to forge a new global identity because it's civilization that is at stake. Now, I called this talk The Scroll of Fate. Perhaps the greatest story about the creation of a new civilization was that of Rome's birth, or in fact, the rebirth of human civilization from the ruins of Troy. Remember the story? It was described in all its brutality and hope by Virgil in his tremendous book, the Aeneid. And here is one of the central scenes. There is Aeneas struggling out of Rome as it collapses around him, carrying his father Anchises on his shoulder, his son Ascanius at his feet, his wife Cruso by his side. This is us. This is us if we don't act, struggling out of the ruins of our civilization. Now, Aeneas' future and that of his new civilization depended, Virgil said, on the scroll of fate. That's the phrase in the poem, the scroll of fate. And in the 6th book, Aeneas is told of something called the golden bough. The golden bough was a gift from the gods. It was the key to entering the underworld. And once you entered the underworld, he would be able to see for the first time a vision of the future of the rebirth of human civilization. This is what it says in the Aeneid. So lift your eyes and search. And once you find it, pull away that bough. It will come willingly, easily, if you are called by fate. So will we be able to lift our eyes? Will we be able to search and find our own golden bough? A vision for the future of our own civilization and the life on which we depend for that civilization. And if we do, will we be able to make it a reality? That is the test for humanity today. That is the great test for our human destiny. Thank you.
Wow, Richard, fantastic. Thank you so very much. So now, moving on with that theme, I'm Patricia Conrad. I'm one of the CUGH board members, and I'm also the Associate Dean for Global Programs in the School of Veterinary Medicine at the University of California, Davis. And I am very fortunate today to have with me, if we could have the slide of the panelists for the Planetary Health panel. Oh, good, sorry. Didn't have my long-distance glasses on. Very fortunate to have 4 of the commissioners who participated along with Richard and others in the preparation of the Rockefeller Foundation's Planetary Health Report, which was published in July of 2015 in The Lancet. I would like to just briefly introduce them. We have the names up here. And if you go to the app, has anybody talked to you about the CUGH 2016 app? Be sure and download it. The bios for all of our panelists and a lot of information about the conference is contained in that app. So with us, oh, I guess I'm gonna have to sit over in the end. That's okay. We'll have 2 women on either side. First, well, let's just kind of go in order. First, we have Alex Iza, who is the Executive Director of the African Population and Health Research Center. Then Samuel Myers, who is the Director of the Planetary Health Alliance at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. We have Subrundu Patianak, if I got that right, who's the Professor of Public Policy and Environmental Economics at Duke University, and Montira Pugirsi, who is the Planetary Health Alliance Science Policy Advisor with the Wildlife Conservation Society. So to get us started, and I think Richard really warmed us up well, but I want you to know, we want the audience to be very involved in this. We're definitely, no matter where we are, we're going to hold the last 20 minutes of this hour for your questions. So I'd like you all to be thinking about you probably are already, the questions you would have liked to ask Richard about planetary health and the questions that are going to come up from our discussion. But out of curiosity right now, how many people in the audience, and I'd like you to stand up, have read the Planetary Health Report? Either published in Lancet and online. All right, good. Now stand up, stay up. Okay, you can stay up. Now, how many people have some idea what planetary health is? Maybe you looked at the little link, the description, okay? Or picked it up from Richard's talk. All right, we'll take those folks, okay? All right, good, that's not cheating, that's good, okay. All right, there's still a lot of people sitting down, so now you can all sit down, all right? But we wanted to get this indication because I want the panel to know what they're up against here, all right? Here are 4 of the best versed people on the Planetary Health Report, and so this is what they need to do. By the end of this session, we want everybody to stand up, not just because you're taking a break, but because you're really engaged in this and inspired to go forth and think about how to put this, the concepts we're going to talk about and the message of the Planetary Health Report into what you're doing in global health. So to start out with, I think we are very fortunate to have Dr. Sam Myers has volunteered to come up, and because we weren't quite sure what Richard was going to say, and most people say that's not unusual, but it was powerful. And so Sam Myers, I'd like to call up to the stage to give us a little introduction to planetary health from his perspective and that of the Commission.
First question is how we get our slides again. So, is this it? No. I think I'm going to need some help with this.
Oops. And here's one. He's the better man for this job.
So there's nothing designed to make you look like more of a dud as a public speaker than following Richard Horton. So Richard, thank you very much for that. Perfect. Great. All right. Well, it's really wonderful to be here. Thank you, Pat. What an unbelievably inspiring sea of faces come together, all with a shared mission of making the world a better place. It's really an incredible honor to be in front of you. I've been asked to give a very brief introduction to planetary health. Some of what I'm going to say overlaps with some of what Richard was saying, but I think I'm going to take a little bit more of a specific health focus as opposed to the extraordinarily eloquent, more societal focus that Richard just presented. So in our report published this past summer in The Lancet, the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health defined planetary health, as Richard said, as, quote, the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. And the core proposition of planetary health is that we all receive enormous public health benefits from a relatively stable set of biophysical conditions around the planet that include the climate system, land cover, biodiversity, coastal barrier systems, fisheries, biogeochemical cycles, and a host of others. And that we are now in the midst of a quiet public health crisis as those systems become more dramatically and pervasively altered than ever in the history of our species. And those changes are driven primarily by human activities. One potential challenge to this proposition is that the health of human civilization, as Richard just showed us, and the state of these natural systems are actually trending in almost opposite directions over the last several decades. So this is what we call the ecological paradox. As you all know, almost all measures of global health have been dramatically improving over the last 50 years, at the same time that human activity is degrading natural systems in ways that are steeply intensifying, whether we're talking about anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions or deforestation or appropriation of fresh water systems or biodiversity loss or a host of others. So how is it that we can say human health depends on intact natural systems if human health is improving at the same time that we're ratcheting up our degradation of those very same systems? And this is a question that we addressed head on in our commission report, and we concluded that, as you can see, that we're deeply concerned that the explanation is straightforward and sobering, that we've been mortgaging the health of future generations to realize economic and development gains in the present, essentially pointing to this enormous issue of what Richard just called intergenerational equity, that essentially we are reaping the outsized benefits of unsustainable resource use while we defray the costs of living under degraded systems to future generations. So just as we've all become aware over recent decades that global health is impacted by social and cultural and political determinants, planetary health would posit that human health is nested in a set of environmental conditions to which we have become adapted and which are now rapidly changing. That human activity is profoundly changing the biophysical conditions that underpin our global food production system, our exposure to infectious disease and natural hazards, even the habitability of some of the places where we live. And the consequences are worrisome. So let me give you a couple of very quick examples. When we think about our exposure to infectious diseases, it's striking that aspects of that exposure are determined by this sort of bewildering array of environmental conditions. And each one of these arrows is substantiated with a rich evidence base. And the point here is not the details of any one of these arrows, but it's striking to notice that our exposure to infectious disease is at least in part determined by things like temperature and precipitation, patterns of land use and land cover, the species composition of biological communities, agricultural runoff, and eutrophication. In another example, we can see that global nutritional outcomes are impacted, which, as an aside, make up a huge proportion of the global burden of disease today, are also impacted by a host of environmental drivers, most of which are currently undergoing rapid change. And this is sort of a fascinating moment in human history today, where we need to increase global food production more rapidly than ever before in human history in order to keep up with demand. At the same time that the fundamental biophysical conditions that undergird all of our food production systems are experiencing the most rapid change ever before in human history. So one example from the research that our group does is we've recently shown that rising concentrations of carbon dioxide are actually significantly altering the nutritional value of the foods that we eat, and are threatening to push hundreds of millions of people into new onset iron, zinc, and protein deficiencies. We've recently found that human health is extremely vulnerable to global pollinator declines, and that we could see up to 1.4 million excess deaths annually as a result of declines in global animal pollinator species around the world. We're just starting to try to connect the dots with leadership from Chris Golden, who's in the audience, looking at how overfishing and ocean acidification and warming associated with climate change alter the status of fisheries around the world, and how the resulting changes in seafood consumption and nutritional and health status in populations around the world. The point here is that global nutritional outcomes are intimately connected to the state of Earth's natural systems. And we could look at a variety of other dimensions of human health and see similar patterns, whether we're looking at population displacement or mental health outcomes or non-communicable diseases. We'd see similarly complex interacting sets of environmental drivers that are enormously relevant. So overall, our concern in the planetary health community is that accelerating human-caused changes to the structure and function of Earth's natural systems represent an urgent global health threat and may drive a significant burden of disease over the next century. Thank you.
Okay, very good. All right, so what I'd like to do next is hear from our other panelists as well. If you, when you, let's say when, for all who haven't, when you have a chance to look at the report, you know, it's big, it's rather overwhelming, and the first, well, we'll hold on that for a minute. What I'd like to ask is our other panelists, each personally, what about planetary health, or about the report specifically, is have you found to be most compelling? I think you just start talking and it comes on. Montera.
Good morning. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Sam, Richard. Inspiring as always. To me, and you've heard this from Sam and Richard as well, the degradation that we ourselves are imposing on our natural systems, our ecosystems, lead to unintended adverse public health impacts. And unless we characterize these impacts well, unless we understand the causal mechanisms underlying environmental change and these human health outcomes, then they won't be taken into account in the decisions that we make about public health, about natural resource use and management. So planetary health has to be more than academic. We have to produce planetary health science in a proactive way, recognizing what the policy gaps and the policy needs are. And if we can do that, then there's a potential for that science, for planetary health, to lead to better decisions, better policies, better practice. And to me, this is the exciting opportunity that planetary health presents. Because after all, planetary health is about moving from lose-lose scenarios to win-win scenarios, where perhaps we might be able to deliver human health benefits by conserving, enhancing, and restoring those natural systems upon which we all depend. So the science to policy and the science to action opportunity that this presents, that we have to act upon, are what's inciting and where we can make a real contribution.
Thanks, Pat. I think for me, there are two things that really get very close to me. One is what Sam already alluded to. It's the magnitude, the levels of effect and the magnitude of the effect you get when you take the confluence of all these stressors on the planet goes to several degrees much higher. So Sam talked about nutrition. So it's not that climate change may affect the quality and quantity of food production, but that is occurring at a time when we actually have to feed, in the next 30 years, 2.4 billion people more, who have different taste buds for different lifestyles and different types of animal protein rather than grains and stuff like that. At the same time that we almost maximizing our ability, available land areas and water and resources and all of that. So when you bring all these things together, then we cannot continue to bury our heads in the sand thinking that all is well. So to me, that's one area. And the second is, I look at myself and I feel, who am I? I'm such a tiny little small person compared to the massive planetary systems. And yet it is me as an individual that is my action that is actually driving most of those changes that are happening. What an awesome power. But also, what massive responsibility. Because the way I act and live does matter for what happens to my planet. It is me, it is my family, it is my community, it is my county, it is my state, it is my country, my region, my continent, and the global community. It is our action as humans that's driving these changes that we see. And to me, that's really something that gets to me from this report.
That's a powerful message. Subrandu.
Yeah, I guess all good stories start with an NIH proposal rejection. So Randy Kramer here from my colleague, it's not that different from the figures that Richard put up, except it was Richard putting them up. There's deforestation, poverty, and there's, say, malaria. When we made this proposal about 15 years ago at this point, it was resoundingly rejected because how could you possibly study that? And a few years later, Jonathan Patz, who's out there, and me and others submitted something to the EPA. Same kind of response. The fact that we've come along, some of us who were sort of compelled that these things existed or at least needed some more studies, to having Richard write this down and the Lancet organizing a commission and some of the global leaders in public health embrace it, and the Rockefeller Foundation come behind it. That's the most compelling, that others have felt compelled that these connections that Tim set us up with, that Jaime was talking about, how can you conceive of human development, of global health progress without sort of looking at the roots of that? That's the most compelling feature. It starts with the rejection, though.
So you mentioned the Lancet, and Alex mentioned climate change, and my understanding is that 1 month before the Planetary Health Report was published in the Lancet, there was a very impressive report on climate change as well, and some in Britain felt that may have even overshadowed the launch of the Planetary Health because so much attention was focused on the climate change. But I wondered, Sam, can you speak to this? What is the relationship between the climate change problems and what you're talking about in the Planetary Health Report?
Is this working?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, whenever, obviously, the human health impacts of climate change are an enormously important and complex topic. When and a lot of our research as a group is focused on health impacts of climate change. When I'm asked to speak about it, though, I find it very, very difficult not to start by contextualizing the questions of climate change impacts on health in the rest of the context of all the other ways that we are transforming our planet's natural systems. And so it's really in the context, as Alex just said, of not only what's happening to the human population and demographic changes and dietary changes, but also, for example, increasing water scarcity and land degradation, losses of arable land associated with sea level rise, changes in soil nutrients, a whole host of other ongoing environmental changes that climate change adds additional headwinds with respect to food production. And the same thing can be said about just about every dimension of health where climate change has impacts. There are other changes to natural systems that are either reducing our resilience or increasing the threats. And so I would say that climate change is a subset of the ways that we're changing all the systems around the planet, and that we really need to frame it in that broad light.
So what you're asking this audience is to think even bigger yet. We're just starting to put our heads, some people, and hopefully more in the United States around climate change, but now here's something even bigger. I think it's really important to this audience of global health enthusiasts and activists and practitioners that we've got to make this real for them. So what would you say to this audience whose focus is on global health, already a huge mission? So why is it, what can you say that's compelling as to why they need to pay attention to and think about this planetary health and how they could go about doing that?
So we don't have a very choreographed plan here, okay? It's supposed to be...
We're spontaneous, okay? We're working in the spontaneous.
So as you heard before, there are multiple environmental changes: climate change, ocean acidification, freshwater drawdowns, that together have synergistic and possibly negative impacts on human health. And we point out in the report that the evidence base, the empirical evidence of understanding how those multiple environmental changes together impact human health are not well characterized. So one call, I guess, for action would be to inform some of the science questions, research questions, as you engage on your theses and dissertations. But I might also add that as far as science policy, and I can talk more about this later, that we really need to understand what decision makers, policymakers need in terms of science. What key environmental change, human health relationships are particularly relevant to decisions that need to be made sooner than later. We saw the very complicated set of SDGs. We know that the science base for those SDGs is very weak, particularly in regards to safe cities and sustainable consumption. So can planetary health help meet some of those needs to strengthen the evidence base for identifying possibly indicators for some of these goals where we can measure progress in reliable, robust ways? One of the ways that we're engaging through the SDGs process is some of us commissioners are working together and with other groups to engage at a high level with the UN Environment Program to help them think through how to move science to action, to policy, in the context of their role in implementing the SDGs. What they've told us they need are science-based strategies to address air quality and water quality. And what's interesting is that the SDGs and planetary health start from the same place. That is, we recognize the need for a healthy environment as the foundation for human health and sustainable development. So with that recognition and the need to integrate healthy environments and healthy people, we think that engaging the UN process through a cross-sectoral planetary health approach can be really helpful in terms of not only informing us on the science that's needed to make better decisions, to make more informed policies, but it goes both ways, and we expect this to be a long-term working dialogue and process. So that's just one example of how we are beginning to engage at the global level in this case.
So Alex, what's it like in Africa? I mean, how can this perspective, this lens of planetary health, how could it change health, and what are you and your team doing in terms of implementing that change?
Thanks, Pat. I think first, if you listen to what Richard said earlier, particularly linking health to some of the other SDGs, you realize that the little interventions and programs we are doing may result in some micro-level impacts on the individual and community levels. But when you take it in the broader context, then it becomes so small to achieve the level of impact we are looking at to achieve sustainable development. If you take Africa, for example, and say I work in the slums in Nairobi, and you have acute respiratory infection from indoor pollution is the #1 killer of children. So why are we interested in that, and we're not looking at some of the major causes of those indoor pollution? Why are women still cooking with stoves inside the same room in which they are sleeping and keeping their children and stuff like that? How do we create interventions that can actually help eliminate those and also benefit our environment through more energy efficient cooked stoves and stuff like that? At the African Population and Health Research Center in Nairobi, we have done a lot. One of the things we've done after the release of the report is to organize a regional lunch where we invited academics and policymakers and different partners to really begin a discussion around these sets of issues. As many of you are aware, maybe Global Health, this is the 7th meeting of the Global Health, Consortium of Global Health Universities. And how many African institutions are members? And maybe it is only now, 20 years after start of global health in the North, that we're beginning to think about it. And maybe in another 10, 15, 20 years, Africa will wake up to the realization that planetary health is actually the main thing we need to focus on now. We don't want that to happen again. So we want to be able to create a momentum, and as we know, most of the effects and impacts that's being projected, Africa is going to get a huge burden arising from these changes to the earth systems. How do we prepare that? How do we create resilience? How do we adapt to those changes? And how do we create policies and systems that can challenge us in the ways to prepare ourselves to address these challenges? So for us as a center, we see that as an area that needs a lot of work, and we have had, through our graduate training programs, begin to create this awareness. The question remains, how do we get the woman in the village who is trying to cut the only tree that is remaining in that place to get firewood, to understand the implications of that? And those challenges are real. And so in thinking about it, we have to look at some of the ways we're able to bring down the communication and the language around planetary health so that it is understood by the person who does not have a PhD. Actually, many people with PhDs still don't get it.
Yeah. As an economist, how are you taking action on this?
So I guess if you're convinced, I hope at this point, the Pied Piper from London who's leading you, and you will believe that this is really a profound opportunity. If we lose it forever. So but opportunities come with challenges. And I think one of the fundamental challenges, picking up on what Manthira just said, is we can name the problem. We can sort of identify where the problems are. The solutions are always more difficult. And the challenges here are coming from the implementation. And implementation is often an afterthought and left for something to be done out there. So my goal so far has been to try to put implementation explain it from a scientific perspective. Keith just mentioned that when there is a theory about when and where people intervene, okay? And we should test those theories on the ground. So if you pay landowners to conserve forests, if you convince communities to be reporting on the condition of their air and water, does that actually then translate into action by those organizations, right? So another leg of implementation is going to be the finance. None of this is going to go anywhere unless we can raise sort of the revenues to sort of support these kinds of interventions, because these are displaced. The person who acts is not the person who bears the consequence. These are displaced across time, across space. And so you need an outside party in some ways, or a collection, and this is again, while our current set of UN organizations have all kinds of problems, you have to have some sort of unity here to sort of sustain and finance these organizations. And lastly, of course, we are academics, we are educators. The fact that only a few of you stood up when Pat asked, how many had heard of this concept. There's many more out here and so there is a course that I offer, and Sam will talk more about it at lunch. The Alliance is very much geared towards a whole curriculum review, a change, thinking about how to take these ideas and sort of bring them into classes. I know there's a student of mine in here Morgan, who, she's in the public policy department. And should she be thinking about planetary health? Well, why not? If you're a public policy practitioner, or will be soon, what do you think you're going to do, which is outside of all the things that all the arrows and boxes and diagrams that Richard and Sam and others display?
Good point, and the point was made, I think, amongst the group. Although there's a mention made in the report about planetary health being a discipline, I think there's agreement this is not just a discipline, this is a transdisciplinary approach. And one of the big challenges we all know is how do you get people to work together in a transdisciplinary way? And I think, Sam, you have some particularly good ideas and thinking around that in terms of the Planetary Health Alliance.
Sure, well, thank you. I guess this is my chance to put in a plug for the new Planetary Health Alliance, which we just got started a couple of months ago. And it's really in response to our sense that there isn't really yet a center of gravity for this field of planetary health, that because it's so transdisciplinary and it draws on people who self-identify in ways that have very little to do with planetary health, that we haven't been able to pull together a sort of critical mass that identifies themselves around these issues as a community. And so we have started the Planetary Health Alliance specifically to try to create that center of gravity, to try to forge a community of practice really around the three domains of research, education, and policy. And there are a host of activities that we're thinking about. The idea is to be very responsive to all of you. We invite every one of you and your institutions to be part of what we're trying to build. Nothing has been set in cement, so we're still in a very iterative process. But ultimately, our goal is to support the growth of vibrant communities around those three themes of research, education, and policy. There's going to be a lunch later on today where we'll have some materials. There's also something on our app that describes how to get involved with the Planetary Health Alliance. So that's something that is underway and that's very concrete that we would love to have you participate in. I want to take the chance to tell a quick story, if I might.
Okay.
I was thinking on the plane, and it just occurred to me that it might be an interesting story for this audience. I was thinking on the plane about what I learned as an undergraduate studying history of medicine and the Broad Street Pump and John Snow, and how it was sort of this iconic moment at the beginning of the public health movement when, this brilliant doctor recognized that the people who were getting cholera in London were really relegated to one group getting their water supply from one system, and that when he took the handle off the Broad Street pump that was supplying that water, the cholera epidemic went away, and what an epiphany. Then I started thinking about a story from Belize, where we've discovered, in the last 10 years, there's a wonderful story in disease ecology in which we've recognized that farmers' practices in the highlands of Belize are causing people 300 miles away in the lowlands to get malaria. And the story goes like this. They're applying a whole lot of synthetic fertilizers to their farmlands. Those fertilizers are running off, leading to a lot of nutrient loading of nitrogen and phosphorus in the lowland aquatic systems. All that nitrogen and phosphorus is actually stimulating a phase shift, and you're getting whole changes in the typhal mats, the vegetation ecology, which actually changes the species composition of plants that are growing in these wetland systems, and then favors habitat for a completely different Anopheline mosquito, which turns out to be a dramatically more effective vector for malaria. The difference between traditional public health and planetary health is the difference between the Broad Street Pump and that story about Belize. It's a lot more complex, it's a lot more indirect, it requires a lot of interdisciplinary work. It's highly policy relevant, which is something that you keep hearing. So once you understand that system, it turns out it matters what those farmers are doing if you want to reduce malaria exposures in lowland systems. So you need to understand it. And once you do understand it, you've characterized a complex system in a way that allows you to change policy and practice to reduce health burdens. And I think that's sort of core to what planetary health is about.
Good analogy. So now, as promised, I want to hold plenty of time for the audience to participate. You'll see that there are microphones up throughout. So if you will start making your way to the microphones and you can queue up behind, we'd like to take your questions. And we'd really like you to please focus on questions, not long stories or soliloquies of on personal feelings, but rather maybe just 1 minute, and please get to the question, please. Okay.
So if I start talking,
Oh, and you can just start talking, I think, and introduce yourself, please.
Okay, Jim Shelton from Global Health Science and Practice. And I've appreciated a lot of this. I think people are struggling, in their own minds about what they can do, actually. And I think that's a lot of what your last set of questions were. And I think we can all sort of join the general movement. But I do have two thoughts. One is, no one's actually, in terms of what health people, as conventionally discussed, do, one is family planning. And nobody's really talked about that. But just for example, if you look at China, think what you want about the one-child policy. But the fact is that since they have hundreds and hundreds of millions of fewer people, they actually are in a much better position to do their share related to climate change and so forth. The other point is that, it did strike me, thinking about Richard's sort of diagram of the recycling society, that, medical care actually is very wasteful. Anybody who's watched this TV, watched the emergency room or the coronary care unit and so forth. And again, one thing I think we ought to be thinking about as health people is, as we sort of export that Western model, which we unfortunately I think are often doing, we're contributing to this problem. So I'm sorry I don't have a question.
You can't get up without a question.
Okay, well,
all right?
my standard thing is, don't you agree with?
Okay, all right, so we want to go with only questions or you'll be disqualified, all right, for your chance on the big drawing, all right? But Alex, you might want to speak to as our demographer here, would you like to speak to any of the points that were made on the demography?
Just to say that the report actually touched on family planning very centrally, and if you read it, it is one of the points that we recommend, and it's a low-hanging fruit to deal with some of the challenges. And particularly when you look at it like in Africa, maybe almost up to 40% of the births are actually unintended. And so addressing that through effective family planning programs and services could make a big difference. And we make the point that demography is not destiny. So even though we projected a doubling of the population, it doesn't need to happen if we can put the right policies in place.
And the second short answer is yes, we agree.
So I can't help myself. Roger Glass from the Fogarty Foundation would like to start there, and then I will promise I will bounce back equally. Roger.
Thanks, Pat. It seems to me one of the controversies here and in global health in general is how do we deal with the urgent versus the important? Here, you have something that's clearly very important, but it's not so urgent in the sense that we have other priorities today that eat up our time and efforts. It's the same with the global health issues. It's Ebola versus tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is clearly globally important, but when we have to deal with the Zikas and the Ebolas, how do we deal with it? How do you suggest that we deal with the chronicity, the long-term effects of this issue and make this a global priority in the face of all the urgent issues that are on people's plates today? Don't all answer at once.
Well, I would dispute that it's not urgent.
Right.
And I understand, I mean, I understand that lens, and it's a lens that I imagine most people would share, but I think the first way we deal with it is by actually disputing whether these are urgent issues. I think that, you know, when you look at, you know, climate change timelines, and these other kinds of changes in natural systems are not dissimilar, that we're not talking about having, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years to ignore these problems and then turn our attention to them once we've solved the other more urgent issues. These are things that are playing out today. So for example, you know, our CO2 nutrition work is showing that by 2050, at rates of CO2 in the atmosphere that we basically can do nothing about at this point, no matter what we do, that we're going to push, you know, around 200 million people into zinc deficiency. Well, that's a tiny fraction of the potential impacts of climate change on nutrition. And when you start to add them up, even though they're not really well characterized, they clearly are affecting hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. So I think it is urgent. I just think we need to understand how to frame it that way to our community and beyond so that it's seen as such.
Lady right here.
I'm Marion Jacobs from South Africa. And I have a question around social responsiveness. Let me just first congratulate Richard on his usual excellent performance, but also to thank the panel for your contribution so far. Starting with us, is the paper of this conference brochure recycled? And can we find a way of calculating our collective carbon footprint in trying to get to this meeting? And my second question around social...
So wait, could you clarify the first question again?
Is
the
our
paper.
Sustainable.
Oh, okay, the purses. Okay, the bags. Okay. The brochure, the program. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that sustainable?
No.
Is the paper recycled?
Yes. Is the paper recycled? I know. Is it, I'm looking at the front row. See who has the answer. I don't have that answer, but we'll try and get you that answer.
So I'm not the only one that needs the answer. I think when we're organizing conferences like this,
We need to
trying to find ways in which we can personally and institutionally do the things that we're talking about. So I'd like to hear about our carbon footprint, but also in terms of social responsiveness.
Right, and I think we're just going to be able to have the one question because there's so many other people waiting, okay? I'm sorry about that, but it's an excellent point, and if we could get everybody to go to the app in future, we might be able to completely eliminate programs, and I'd be completely with you on that, completely. Yes, sir.
Quentin Eichmann, Vanderbilt University. Richard Horton quoted Nietzsche saying words are very important. So I'm curious, we used to have the term international health, then global health, now planetary. Are there any constraints on the term global health? And if so, what are the implications for how possibly an organization like CUGH should restructure itself? I know that's a very broad question, but I'm also interested in just the terminologies, what we should be doing about that.
Okay, and the question, the terminology relating specifically to global health and whether or not planetary health is separate from global health or could be integrated into global health. Is that your...
whether there are any constraints on actually using the term global health at this point.
Okay, so let's get the panelists. I would personally say, from having been involved in global health, I would see planetary health as being essential to the fabric of global health. And I'm hoping that that consensus will come from this meeting, that it will be more accessible moving forward if planetary health is and global health are together and is the way we view health for the world. But your comments?
I was just going to say that planetary health has put the environment a little bit more centrally and focused on that. But of course, you can't achieve many of the global health outcomes unless you pay attention to the air, the water, the mosquitoes, and etc. So I think it's just putting the emphasis on sustainable development and on the planet and the environmental channels a little bit more, to some extent.
It's also more about the practice of global health as is currently conceptualized with the focus on human health. Actually, that limits then the thinking around planetary health. But so if you then want to broaden that, the constraint you have is that our current understanding and practice of global health is what puts that constraint within the terminology.
And I would say, having been involved with CUGH for the last 5 years, that from the onset, I was attracted to this organization because it did embrace the idea of One Health, the interconnectedness of humans, animals, and the environment. And last year, in agreement, we added global environmental health as a companion in that interest group, because in One Health, the environmental aspect wasn't really rising up and getting the attention that it should. We had a meeting, luncheon meeting also last year on that. So I see this as a progression in that direction, but this is where we want, you are the membership of CUGH. This is what we want to hear from you. But it certainly is in line with the mission of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. Over there.
Good afternoon. Good morning. You touched exactly on what I was going to talk about. My name is Mamie Saki Harris, UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm also with the North Carolina One Health Collaborative, and I was part of the discussions last year. And my question is, first of all, I want to say thanks very much to the panelists. Really, really good presentation. How can we see more of what you just said? How can we see a wider, more transdisciplinary audience? This is a great panel, but I don't see any one from veterinary health sitting on the panel, so that we can really start to see health not just from the human perspective, but also from the environment and the animal perspective as well. So what's being done to really ensure that we can make that more fundamental to what we're doing? And with the Public Health Alliance, the Planetary Health Alliance, is there going to be steps to make sure that we have individuals there who are not just looking at this from the human perspective, but also from the animal and the environmental?
Excellent question. Did you want to speak to that, Sam? Then I'd like to make a comment.
Sure. I mean, I think actually both the last two questions are speaking to a really important question of identity, fundamentally. You know, is global health the same as planetary health? Is One Health the same as planetary health? And I actually would be an advocate for being a splitter more than a lumper in this conversation. So I think there is something relatively specific about understanding that how we're managing our planet's natural systems has become an urgent public health issue as a result of the degradation of those systems, as a sort of full stop. There is no question that we feel enormous affinity with the One Health community, which has historically been more focused on the connections between human health and animal health, and then also thinking about environmental health. And that's a critical part of what we're talking about and a critical partnership. So Steve Osofsky, who's a veterinarian who couldn't be here today, but is a very core member of our team, has been a real leader in the One Health movement, and we hope to build those partnerships. But I don't think you necessarily move things forward by just saying everything is the same as everything. And I would still argue that there's a role for the term global health, which is, as Subrendu said, not necessarily intensely focused on environmental drivers per se, but is able to incorporate what planetary health does within its rubric. And I would say that there's a realm for a focus on the relationship between animal health and human health that's been historically represented by the One Health community, and that's a critical relationship too, but it's not the same necessarily as planetary health, and that there's actually some value in keeping those terms somewhat separate.
So that's the perspective of a splitter. As a lumper, okay, whose major motivator is to see that this effort, planetary health, is as successful as possible, I believe in that since all three, global health, One Health, planetary health, all have underlying the same important message, and that is that we and our health and our relationships to other living systems and the ecosystems in which we live are all important to health. We share that, and we're all, I think, in agreement that it takes a transdisciplinary effort to be successful. So what I would hate to see is to have a conference that is just veterinarians, a conference that's or one that's primarily environmental people, and then the human health people are in a completely separate group, because I think we're continuing the siloed approach. It's where is the greatest power to have the greatest benefit for health in the globe, and that's what CUGH wants, and that's what we'll be discussing, is how can that be most effective. So now back here.
Okay.
Oh, a comment. Go ahead.
Could I follow up on that? I think the recognition that environmental change caused by us results in these adverse, sometimes unintended consequences on health is not just a challenge that we recognize in the report, but also opportunities to intervene, to not only minimize, but perhaps even prevent some of these risks from occurring, or these adverse health outcomes from occurring in the first place. So that's the opportunity for new approaches, new solutions to work together. Now, Subrendu, who's an natural resource economist who's been working in the health context for a long time, mentioned the importance of costing health, particularly in the public policy domain. So are there tools that we can develop that would account for and quantify the public health impacts of some of the activities, changes that we are making to the environment? In many ways, we're asking new questions here. Can we manage our natural resources, not just for the sake of saving the environment, but for the benefit of human health? How do we manage our lands for public health?
So we only have a couple minutes left.
Then I want to go back to implementation, policy, action. The really remarkable event that Alex and his team hosted in Nairobi when we launched our report there brought together National Academies members, ministries, representatives, and NGOs to talk about how we could actually put the report into action and what it would mean to East Africa. And they had some very key insights, including that we're very, very good at planning, but not very good at implementation. So what is it going to take? How do we actually share information in effective, sustained ways to inform evidence-based decision-making?
Right.
That's what we're all looking for.
Right.
Under what conditions does restoring, enhancing, conserving ecosystems benefit human health? That type of intervention research is what we need. There are outstanding science questions that need to be answered.
And then translation to policy is what I'm hearing you say. I think we may only be able to take one more question to stay on time. Over here.
Afaf Milis from the University of Pennsylvania. So in our Lancet report, we did say that gender is fundamental to sustainable health. So I would like this panel to think about, put the glasses of gender on, and talk about in what way is it part of the problem, and in what way it could be part of the solution, to be thinking about women of the world and to be thinking about gender as a fundamental solution variable there. And I'd like to hear from you about that.
Anyone speak to that?
Sure. I mean, at one level, of course, when these commissions are commissioned, I have no idea how this comes about, but the fact that there is already a commission on gender, on climate change, it sort of forces us not to repeat some of the things that you all have said. But there is no question that the disproportionate burden of environmental change falls on women, okay? So the wood that they have to haul, the water that they have to get, the first dose of the nutritional allocation inside the house, this is clearly, the burden is borne by women. And it has generational effects because they are the first line of sight primary caregiver. And so we don't, I mean, the reason it's not all over the report is because there's an entire other report on gender and health, and it's sort of undercutting, you know, I mean, we could draw these matrices in very, very many different ways, but it's fundamental to planetary health, I would say.
So I'm afraid, though we have probably some great questions waiting, to honor the time, and we're already a minute over, we're going to have to end this session. And I personally would like to ask you to give a big round of applause for our panelists. And they will be around, so ask them questions, and also 1 to 2, there is a discussion on planetary health. If it's not already filled up, you're very welcome.
Sorry, can I ask you a quick